Welcome, traveller, wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is for you right now. I invite you to settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander back through the fog of time. If you're enjoying this journey through history, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're from and what time it is as you're watching. We always love hearing from our viewers across the world. Now, let's talk about nights. Not the shining, glorious romance novel nights. No, we're going to talk about what it actually meant to be a knight in the medieval world. And spoiler alert, it kind of sucked. You see, knighthood was supposed to be this elevated state of honor, chivalry, loyalty, gallant battles, and shining armor. But behind the poetry and pageantry, reality was heavy. Literally, the average suit of armor could weigh anywhere from 45 to 70 pounds. It was painstakingly strapped onto the knight by a squire, usually some exhausted teenager who hadn't slept because the horses broke loose again last night. The process took forever, and once everything was on, you couldn't really scratch your own nose, let alone enjoy a battlefield lunch. Contrary to what movies suggest, knights didn't just stride into battle gracefully. They clanked, groaned, shuffled, and if they fell down, well, good luck getting back up without help. They were mobile tanks with poor ventilation. And then there were the horses. Knights didn't just ride any old horse. They needed massive war horses, destriers, that could carry all that weight, charge enemies, and hopefully not trample their own side. These horses were expensive, temperamental, and probably more noble than the knights themselves. Keeping one fed and trained was a full-time job, which, surprise, you were also paying for. Now, let's say you were lucky enough to actually become a knight. First, you had to come from the right bloodline. No peasant boy could just swing a stick and rise through the ranks, not unless a miracle happened and someone highborn got sentimental. You trained from childhood, often sent away to another lord's household to serve as a page, then a squire, and then maybe, if you didn't die of dysentery or horse kicks, you'd get dubbed a knight. Your reward? A lifetime of debt, political obligations, and being expected to show up to fight whenever your lord called. And fight for what? Glory? Honor? Sometimes. Other times, it was because someone said a thing about someone else's cousin's land rights, and suddenly, everyone's on horseback swinging steel in the mud over half an acre of sheep pasture. Still, people revered knights. Children looked up to them. Songs were written. Ladies swooned. Meanwhile, the knight was probably nursing a broken rib, trying to sleep upright in armor that reeked of sweat and rust, and wondering if his squire remembered to pack the salted pork, or if it was just hardtack again. This was the real beginning of a knight's life, uncomfortable, demanding, and nowhere near as polished as the tales suggest. And yet, for all that, many still longed for the title. But before a man could swing a sword in the name of chivalry, or ride into battle with a pennant snapping dramatically behind him, he had to survive one of the most physically demanding, thankless, and often humiliating apprenticeships in the medieval world. Becoming a knight wasn't a career choice. It was more like an inherited burden, wrapped in shiny expectations and tied with a ribbon of duty. And it started young, very young. Boys of noble birth were sent off to live in another lord's castle as early as the age of 7. Not to be pampered and educated in some high tower, mind you, but to work. At this stage, they were known as pages. And what did pages do? Let's see. They cleaned armour, fetched food, served at tables, ran messages through muddy courtyards, polished boots, and memorised endless rules of etiquette. Spill wine on a nobleman's lap? That's a beating. Forget to bow to the lord's pig-faced cousin visiting from the next fief over? Beating. Late to morning prayers? You guessed it, beating. It wasn't Hogwarts. It was more like a very strict boarding school where the punishment was physical labour and the graduation gift was slightly less physical labour. If a boy survived this stage and didn't develop a permanent limp or get sent home in disgrace, he graduated around age 14 to the next level, Squire. This was like being a knight's personal assistant, except instead of answering emails and booking appointments, you were responsible for maintaining a full armoury, caring for an irritable warhorse with a taste for human fingers, and trying to learn combat without dying. Squires had to be everywhere, all the time. They followed their knight into battle, not to fight, but to drag their master off the field if he got injured or fell off his horse like a shiny, groaning turtle. They were the ones who had to clean the armour, oil the weapons, tend the wounds, and remember to pack clean under tunics, because chafing under chainmail? That's how legends don't get made. Training was brutal. Hours of sword practice, shield drills, archery, horseback riding, and more sword practice. You'd be bruised, blistered, and exhausted. The best part? You got to do all this in full gear during summer. Because nothing says chivalry like sweating through 3 layers of wool and steel. But it wasn't just the physical strain. Squires were expected to absorb the full moral and spiritual code of knighthood, called chivalry, which sounds poetic until you realise it basically meant obeying your lord without question, never questioning the church, never showing fear, and dying with honour even if your feet were numb and you hadn't eaten in 2 days. Assuming you proved yourself by fighting bravely, serving loyally, or just outlasting everyone else, you might be chosen for the great honour of knighthood. The dubbing ceremony was lavish and symbolic. You fasted the night before, bathed for once, prayed in your cleanest tunic, and knelt before a noble who tapped your shoulders with a sword and declared you a knight. And then, boom, you're in debt. Because the very next thing you had to do was buy all your gear: armour, weapons, horse, saddle, tents, servants, repairs. It was like graduating college with a degree in warfare and a mountain of student loans. Except your job might involve getting skewered on a battlefield in France. So yes, becoming a knight was a long, painful road filled with mud, chores, injuries, and expectations, punctuated occasionally by roasted meats and the possibility of impressing someone at a feast. Not exactly the glamorous, slow-motion training montage from the movies, but still, it was a path many walked, and once you were finally a knight, the real work began. So, you've made it. You survived your bruising years as a page, endured the endless drills and smelly armour polishing of squirehood, and now, at last, you are a knight. You've got the sword, the horse, and probably an impressive sounding name like Sir Cedric of Dunbridge or Sir Ewan the Resolutely Average. But what does that actually mean? What's life like now? Well, if you're imagining constant tournaments, grand feasts, and heroic battles on scenic hillsides, it might be time to adjust your expectations. Because being a knight was a job, and like many jobs, it was often boring, dirty, political, and exhausting. Let's begin with the setting. Most knights didn't live in big castles. That was for the nobility, the real money. If you were lucky, you had a stone manor. If not, a wooden house with a thatched roof and questionable insulation would have to do. These homes weren't glamorous. Your bedroom was drafty. The hall smelled faintly of old turnips and wet fur, and plumbing. Well, the less said about medieval toilets, the better. Let's just say chamber pots were involved, and they were nobody's favourite part of the day. Your mornings started early. Before dawn, servants would stir, animals needed feeding, and your steward might already be at your door, asking why the barley shipment hadn't arrived. You might be expected to resolve disputes between peasants on your land, like who really owns that suspiciously mobile fence, or mediate a marriage disagreement involving 2 goats and a chicken. Not exactly dragon slaying. And while you weren't always at war, you had to prepare for it constantly. That meant drilling with your men, checking the condition of your armor and weapons, and making sure your horse didn't try to bite your stable master again. Speaking of armor, it wasn't just for show. Maintaining it was a full-time chore. It rusted, dented, stank, and needed cleaning with vinegar, sand, and a lot of elbow grease. If your squire slacked off, you'd be the one clanking into battle with a breastplate that smelled like last year's stew. Meals were humble most days. Bread, cheese, salted meat, maybe a pottage stew. Feasts happened, yes, but they were rare and usually for someone else's wedding or a lord's visit. And if you were hosting, congratulations. That means you're paying for the ale, the roast boar, the lute player, and the inevitable clean-up after someone's uncle drinks too much and falls into the well. Then there was the travel. Knights were often on the move, attending tournaments, checking on vassals, accompanying their lord to court, or simply patrolling their lands. Roads were muddy, bridges were questionable, and weather was a constant adversary. Your beautifully forged boots? Not waterproof. Now let's talk expectations. You weren't just a soldier, you were a symbol. You had to live by the chivalric code: bravery, courtesy, loyalty, humility, and faith. Sounds noble, but in practice it meant never showing fear, never disobeying your lord, never dishonouring a lady, and never, ever complaining about how much your back hurt. You were also a tax collector, a judge, a landlord, and sometimes a diplomat. If a neighbouring knight's cattle wandered onto your land, you had to decide whether to send a polite messenger, file a legal complaint, or just steal them back and hope no one started a feud. And if your lord called you to war, you went. No matter the season, no matter how tired you were, and no matter if you were already dealing with a flu outbreak in your village. Because refusal wasn't an option. Knighthood came with status, but also with chains, the invisible kind, tied to duty, hierarchy, and an unending list of obligations. The life of a knight was not a fantasy novel. It was more like a middle management position in a military corporation, with armour instead of a briefcase. Yes, there were moments of excitement. Yes, there was prestige. But between those shining battles were long weeks of patrols, paperwork, mud, and mutton. If the sword was the symbol of a knight's power, chivalry was supposed to be the soul that wielded it. Knighthood wasn't just about fighting, it was about fighting with honour. Knights were expected to be brave, humble, merciful, devout, courtly, and loyal, all while carrying 60 pounds of steel on their back and probably a mild concussion. It sounds noble in theory. In practice, the code of chivalry was a tangled, often hypocritical mess. Let's take a closer look. First, loyalty to your lord. This was sacred. No matter what your personal beliefs or moral compass told you, you were expected to obey your feudal superior. If your lord said, "Go torch that village," you did it. If he decided to go to war over a marriage slight or a sheep-related land dispute, you packed your bags and sharpened your sword. This loyalty wasn't mutual, by the way. Your lord could toss you aside if it suited him politically, and you were just expected to nod and accept it, because that was the natural order. Then there was bravery. A knight must never flee battle, never show fear, and never surrender. Even if your enemies outnumbered you 5-1 and your sword broke halfway through the skirmish. The ideal knight was supposed to die honourably rather than retreat shamefully. In other words, survival was not the priority. A good knight didn't run. A good knight died artistically. Then we get to mercy. Knights were told to show kindness to the defeated, but only if the defeated were other knights, peasants, archers, conscripted foot soldiers, or foreign mercenaries, not part of the club. Show mercy to them, and you might be seen as weak. In fact, the concept of mercy could shift wildly based on how much money your opponent had. If your captured enemy was wealthy, mercy meant ransoming him for a fat payout. If he was poor, mercy might mean a quick death instead of a slow one. Next was faith. A knight had to be deeply religious, attend mass, donate to the church, and wage holy war when called upon. However, this religious fervour didn't stop many knights from looting monasteries when they needed coin, or ignoring every moral teaching when the wine was flowing after a feast. One moment, a knight would be kneeling in prayer before battle, asking for God's protection. The next, he'd be smashing in the skull of a retreating soldier with a morning star. A complicated relationship with the Almighty, to say the least. Then we come to courtesy to women, perhaps the most misunderstood piece of chivalry. Knights were expected to revere women, particularly noble women, as paragons of grace and virtue. They composed poetry, sang songs, pledged undying love, and wore tokens of their ladies in battle. This courtly love sounds romantic, until you realise most of it was about idealising women from a distance. Actual marriage was usually a political arrangement. Wives were expected to manage the household, produce heirs, and keep their husband's estate running smoothly while he gallivanted off to war, or flirted with another lady at a tournament. And heaven help a woman who didn't fit the mould of the delicate, obedient noble lady. If she was outspoken, clever, or inconveniently poor, she usually didn't make it into the ballads. All these virtues, loyalty, bravery, mercy, faith, and courtliness were held up as the shining standard of knightly conduct, but few could actually live up to all of them at once. How could you be merciful and ruthless in war? How could you be humble and proud of your noble blood? How could you revere women while treating your wife like part of your estate? The answer was, you couldn't. Not really. And so, knights did what humans always do when faced with an impossible set of expectations. They bent the rules, justified their contradictions, and hoped that if they died with a sword in their hand, they'd be remembered for the ideal, not the messy truth. If you've ever watched a medieval battle in a movie, you might picture a sweeping cavalry charge across open fields, shining armor glinting in the sun, a heroic duel between two noble warriors at the climax. But in reality, most battles were a nightmare of filth, confusion, and very personal, very horrifying violence. Let's set the stage. You're a knight. You've spent days, maybe weeks, traveling to the battlefield. Your armor is heavy. Your nerves are frayed. You haven't slept properly in a week because your tent leaks, the ground is hard, and someone in your unit snores like an ox being stepped on. The morning of the battle arrives. There's no grand music, no morale-boosting speech from a commander on a hill. Just cold wind, the stench of sweat and damp wool, and the growing realization that you might not see another sunrise. Your armor, depending on the era, might be chainmail or plate. Either way, it's restrictive. You move like a very determined turtle. Your helmet blocks your peripheral vision and muffles sound. You can barely hear your comrades over the mounting noise. Horses snorting, men praying, orders being shouted, weapons being unsheathed. Now, battle begins. Forget elegant swordplay. The real fighting is close, ugly, and chaotic. You swing wildly, trying to land a blow while staying alive. You can't tell friend from foe half the time. Mud clings to your boots, blood spatters across your visor. You might slip, fall, and if you go down in a crush of bodies, there's a real chance you don't get up again. Not because of your injuries, but because you're trampled by your own men. If you're lucky, you're fighting on dry ground. If you're not, welcome to a churned up, knee-deep swamp of mud, blood, manure, and broken bodies. Men drown in it, literally drown in dirt. Weapons weren't clean instruments either. Swords didn't glide through the air like in movies. They got stuck in bone, jammed in chainmail, snapped under pressure. Axes and maces crushed, not sliced. They left behind shattered limbs, caved-in skulls, and horrific screams. And it wasn't always over quickly. Many medieval battles dragged on for hours. Imagine swinging a 15-pound weapon in armor while dodging death for an entire afternoon. Muscles burn, vision blurs, panic rises, your grip slips, your feet slide, and someone drives a lance into your ribs. If you fall, there's no gentleman waiting to give you a clean death. A dagger to the armpit, groin or visor slit was the norm. Knights had to be killed in the gaps of their armor, and those gaps were intimate. Many died staring into the eyes of the man who ended them. And if you were captured, congratulations. You might be ransomed if you were worth something. Otherwise, you were looted, stripped, and often killed anyway, especially if your captor didn't have the means to feed you. Now, imagine doing this in summer heat or in the freezing cold while starving, dehydrated, or riddled with dysentery. Yes, dysentery, that delightful companion of every medieval army. It spread like wildfire through camps. Many soldiers died in their tents before even seeing the battlefield. Knights weren't exempt from this. Their higher status gave them slightly better food and slightly more private latrines. But disease didn't care if you were wearing silk under your chainmail. And the aftermath, even worse. The field is littered with the dead and dying. Some scream for help, others whisper prayers. Birds circle overhead, carrion animals arrive. If you're still standing, you walk among the corpses, perhaps looking for fallen friends or gathering spoils from the dead. And that chivalric mercy we discussed? Rare in these moments. Some knights went from corpse to corpse, finishing off the wounded. Others stripped armour from bodies and left them to rot. Burial was haphazard, if it happened at all. Most corpses were left for nature to reclaim. You return to camp. You're not triumphant. You're exhausted, possibly wounded, and deeply changed. Glory? Not exactly. That shining legend you imagined, tarnished, dented, and covered in someone else's blood. And even if you survived, there was always the next war, the next feud, the next rebellion to put down. So, you've survived your latest military campaign, earned a few scars, and maybe even a new nickname, like Godfrey the One-Eyed, or Richard of the Mild Concussion. Now it's time to celebrate knightly valour the civilised way, with a tournament. At least, that's how it sounds. But if you're imagining a dignified affair with polite duels and cheering maidens tossing flowers, think again. Medieval tournaments were wild, dangerous, chaotic, and only marginally less lethal than actual war. Let's start with the melee, the original centerpiece of the tournament. This wasn't a one-on-one duel. This was basically group warfare as entertainment. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of knights would split into teams and charge at each other across wide open fields. It was a full contact, full metal, no holds barred brawl with blunt weapons and real bruises. The goal? Knock opponents off their horses, capture them, and, if you were lucky, ransom them back for a tidy profit. Yes, even in pretend war, the economics of knighthood came into play. There were rules, sure, but those rules varied wildly, were rarely enforced, and mostly depended on the host's mood and how much ale the knights had downed before mounting up. Broken bones, crushed hands, internal bleeding, par for the course. There are even records of knights dying in the melee, not retiring, not injured, just flat out, trampled to death, one sword to the neck, dying. Naturally, kings and church leaders began to worry that tournaments were a bit too effective at killing the very people they depended on. So reforms were made. Enter the joust. Ah yes, the elegant tilt, the thunder of hooves, two knights charging at each other with lances aiming for the chest or head. A noble test of skill and courage, right? Well, kind of. Jousting was more organised, more theatrical, and a great way to show off in front of royalty and ladies. But it was still extremely dangerous. Lances were supposed to be blunted, yes, but the force of impact from a charging horse and a 12-foot lance could still unseat a man and snap bones like twigs. Helmets were dented, collarbones were shattered. There were even fatal brain injuries, despite all that steel. And if you fell wrong, the horse might land on you. Or worse, your own lance might break the wrong way and skewer you. There are accounts of knights getting splinters of lance through the eye slit of their helmets. Not to mention, prestige pressure was sky high. These weren't just sports, they were social battlefields. Tournaments were where you proved yourself, gained fame, attracted the attention of lords or potential brides. They were the medieval version of job interviews meets pro wrestling meets gladiator arena. A single good showing could make your career. A poor one? You might be laughed out of noble company or forgotten entirely. And the audience expectations were no joke. Tournaments were often massive public spectacles. Lords and ladies filled pavilions. Vendors sold food. Minstrels played songs. And everyone was watching you. Did you perform with elegance? Did your armor shine? Was your crest impressive? Did you fight bravely? Did you look good while bleeding from the nose? The pressure to impress was enormous, and knights went to absurd lengths to stand out. Some wore wildly expensive armor, others performed stunts. Some even challenged famous knights on the spot, hoping for a chance to show off. And of course, the after party was just as important. Feasting, dancing, storytelling, and occasionally brawling in the tavern afterward, all were part of the nightly experience. These weren't just contests, they were status rituals, places to see and be seen, to form alliances, show loyalty, or stir up a rivalry or two. But here's the real irony. Tournaments were meant to prepare knights for battle, but more often, they blurred the line between play and peril. They became theatres of controlled violence, where the same risks as war were repackaged as entertainment. And just like war, many walked away wounded, and a few never walked away at all. Knights are often portrayed as high-born warriors, gliding through castles in shining armour, living lives of luxury and glory. But let's cut through the shine and polish. Being a knight was extremely expensive, deeply political, and often financially ruinous. To even qualify for knighthood, you needed wealth. Not peasant wealth, not merchant wealth. We're talking landowning, tax collecting, court attending wealth. You were usually the son of a noble, or at least someone rich enough to buy you a title and outfit you like a walking tank. From childhood, you were groomed for this path. First, as a page. Then, around age 14, you became a squire, training under an established knight. You learned to ride, fight, serve, and behave. And when the time came to be knighted, usually in your late teens or early 20s, it was a ceremonial milestone, but also a giant bill. The knighting ceremony itself required a new set of fine clothes, a sword of quality, and often a celebratory feast. And guess who paid for it? You, or your family. The armour alone could bankrupt a minor noble family. A full suit of well-made plate armour might cost as much as a house, even more if it was custom fitted or imported. Then there were the horses. A knight didn't just need a horse, he needed at least 3. A destrier, or war horse, massive, trained, and extremely costly. A palfrey for everyday riding and travel. A pack horse for carrying equipment, tents, supplies, and sometimes your slightly less brave squire. Each horse needed feed, stabling, gear, and replacements if they died in battle or tripped in a pothole. Add to that your armor and weapons: sword, dagger, lance, mace, shield, all of which needed regular maintenance. A rusty blade was a dead knight waiting to happen. And don't forget the squires and servants, whose job it was to dress you, polish your armor, care for your horses, carry your gear, and generally prevent you from dying stupidly. They expected food, clothing, and sometimes pay. Now, if you were lucky, your lord or king might fund your expenses if you were summoned for war. But that came with strings, loyalty, service, and the possibility of very inconvenient death on some foreign field. Many knights relied on plunder to make ends meet: loot from war, spoils from captured enemies, or payment from ransomed prisoners. But war was unreliable. Sometimes you came home richer. Sometimes you came home in a sack. So what if you weren't at war? You still had to maintain the lifestyle. Tournaments weren't free. Travel wasn't free. Feeding your horses, hiring armourers, replacing worn-out weapons. None of it came cheap. And heaven help you if you wanted to get married. Dowries were hefty, and your future father-in-law expected you to keep his daughter in style. To support all this, many knights managed estates, but managing land meant navigating taxes, hiring stewards, appeasing tenants, and making sure the local baron didn't decide to eat your borders for lunch. Some knights turned to courtly service. They became bodyguards, diplomats, or advisors. These roles paid better and offered social advancement, but came with new expenses. Court life meant fine clothes, gifts, and constant social maneuvering. Others sank into debt. In fact, a shockingly high number of knights ended their days financially ruined. They borrowed money from merchants, took out loans from the church, or sold pieces of their land bit by bit to stay afloat. Even ransom could bankrupt a knight. If you were captured in battle, your enemy might demand a ransom equal to your yearly income, sometimes more. If your family couldn't pay, you sat in a dungeon. Or worse, your captors started mailing pieces of your equipment back to your relatives as a warning. Pay up, or Sir Geoffrey's next package might be an ear. So while the title of Sir came with prestige, it also came with pressure. You weren't just expected to be brave. You were expected to look the part, live the part, and pay dearly for the part. All of this made being a knight less of a calling and more of a lifelong hustle, where even the best warriors sometimes ended up broke, forgotten, or begging for a post as a gatekeeper at someone else's castle. It gleams in the sunlight, catches the eye from a distance, and instantly declares, "This man is not to be trifled with." Knightly armour was a marvel of medieval engineering, elegant, fearsome, and deeply symbolic of a warrior's status. But behind the glint of polished steel was a heavy, hot, and often high-maintenance burden. Let's strip down what it really meant to wear a second skin made of metal. A full suit of plate armour in the later Middle Ages could weigh anywhere from 45 to 60 pounds, 20 to 27 kilograms. Now, contrary to popular myth, knights could move in armour. They could run, mount horses, even do cartwheels, if they were well trained and the armour was properly fitted. but that weight still took its toll. Now imagine wearing all that while climbing a muddy hill in the rain, while dodging arrows and trying not to fall face first into a ditch. Exhaustion set in quickly, especially during long battles or marches, and when you were tired in armour, you became slow, and slow on the battlefield meant dead. And don't even think about taking a nap in it. Sleeping in full armour wasn't just uncomfortable, it could lead to bruises, blisters, and muscle cramps. Some knights even developed long-term joint issues from years of strain. Picture yourself under the blazing summer sun, encased head to toe in steel. There's no airflow. Your own body heat is trapped inside. Within minutes, you're sweating like a pig at a feast, and dehydration starts to set in. On the flip side, in winter, that same metal turned freezing. Without sufficient padding underneath, it was like wearing an icebox. And when it rained or snowed, rust, a knight's worst enemy. Armour had to be constantly dried, oiled, and maintained, or it would literally rot from within, which meant that every knight either had to become a part-time blacksmith or hire someone who was. Armour was custom work. You didn't stroll into a medieval Walmart and buy knight armour size M. You went to a master armourer, someone who measured you piece by piece and forged every component to fit. Helmets, cuirasses, gauntlets, greaves, sabatons. Each had to be perfectly shaped, or it could chafe, pinch, or even cripple you during combat. This process was not cheap. A high-quality suit of armour might cost the equivalent of dozens of cows, or a year's income for a minor noble. And it didn't stop there. Armour broke. It got dented. Parts wore out. You had to replace or repair it constantly. And every time a new style of warfare came into fashion, or your rivals upgraded their gear, you had to keep up, or risk becoming obsolete. So knights were in a never-ending arms race, literally. Ever try looking through a slit the width of a letter opener while someone tries to murder you? Helmets like the Great Helm or bassinet severely limited peripheral vision. Yes, they protected your face, but at the cost of awareness. Many knights had to rely on their squires or fellow soldiers to shout out dangers they couldn't see coming. This made knights especially vulnerable to flanking attacks, trip hazards, and even low-hanging branches. Nature's silent assassins. In a chaotic battlefield, one wrong step and you could find yourself on the ground. Falling in full armour was more than embarrassing. It was potentially fatal. If you were knocked off your horse and hit the ground hard, you might be too stunned or disoriented to get up. And if your opponent got to you first, that beautiful armour suddenly became your coffin. A well-placed dagger could slip through the gaps in your visor or under your armpit. This is why many knights carried misericord daggers, thin blades designed specifically to pierce the gaps in armour and deliver the killing blow. And if you fell in the wrong place, say a muddy ditch or a river, you might not just be defeated, you might drown in your own suit, like a steel-clad turtle flipped on its back. It happened more than you'd think. To the outside world, the knight in armour was a walking legend. But beneath the steel was a man who often felt more like a beast of burden than a hero. Armour made you formidable, but also fragile in unexpected ways. It was empowering and imprisoning, all at once. And worst of all, you weren't just expected to wear the armour. You had to look good in it. Appearances mattered. Gleaming plate and fine engraving spoke of wealth and nobility. If your armour was dull, dented, or, heaven forbid, outdated, people noticed. It wasn't enough to survive in it. You had to excel in it. Or you were just another heavy, sweating, half-blind man waiting for a quicker, lighter foot soldier to run a spear between your ribs. Chivalry. The word conjures images of gallant warriors protecting the innocent, defending the weak, and serving a noble cause with unwavering honour. It's the moral backbone of the medieval knight, the shining code inscribed not on paper, but in soul and steel. But like many grand ideas, chivalry was complicated. Beneath the poetry, the pageantry, and the pomp, the code of chivalry was less a law and more a performance. And like any performance, its greatest champions often had the dirtiest hands. The chivalric code as it survives in legend: rescue maidens, honour your lord, protect the church, fight fairly, is largely fictional, shaped more by romantic literature than battlefield reality. In truth, chivalry was never a single, written down system. It was an ever-shifting blend of expectations pushed by the church, the nobility, and later by courtly poets who had never worn armour. In its ideal form, a knight was supposed to be brave in battle, loyal to his liege, courteous to women, especially noble women, honourable in victory, pious in faith, just in governance. But real life wasn't so tidy. For example, defending the weak often applied only to Christian women of noble birth. A peasant girl? Not so much. An enemy woman? Fair game, in many grim circumstances. And honourable combat? That was rarely practiced when survival was at stake. If you could stab your opponent from behind while he was drinking water, many knights did. The battlefield wasn't a poetry recital. It was carnage. Chivalry wasn't just about doing good. It was a tool of power. A knight who acted chivalrously gained reputation, favour, and sometimes land. Kings rewarded knights who modelled good behaviour. The church elevated those who defended pilgrims or fought in the Crusades. And noble families sought marriages with those seen as paragons of knightly virtue. So behaving chivalrously could be profitable, but it was often just surface deep. A knight might deliver a rousing sermon on honour and then burn down a village the next day, so long as it served his lord. As long as someone wrote a flattering poem about him afterward, all was forgiven. This is where chroniclers, minstrels, and court writers come in. Many knights' reputations were carefully curated propaganda, shaped by the stories told in castle halls. The truth often stayed buried on the bloodied ground. The church loved the idea of chivalry, knights who fought to defend Christian lands, or more importantly, the church's interests, were glorified. Crusading knights were given pardons for sins, often quite gruesome ones, simply because they wielded the sword in the name of God. But the church also wanted to tame the violent nobility, so it created movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which aimed to reduce violence against non-combatants and restrict fighting on holy days. These rules were often ignored. Knights still sacked monasteries, extorted villages, and fought in bloody feuds, even on Sundays. But so long as they wore a cross and made a donation, they might still die with honour. In short, chivalry was as much about image as integrity. And then, of course, came courtly love. The idea that a knight should serve a lady, pine nobly from afar, and perform brave deeds in her name became popular in the 12th and 13th century courts. Troubadours spread these tales like wildfire. But again, fiction and fact parted ways. Many knights had arranged marriages and mistresses. Courtly love was often just emotional theatre, flattering words, stolen glances, maybe a romantic poem, followed by a tournament fight meant to honour the lady in question. In practice, these relationships were about status, politics, and display, not emotional connection. It was a world where appearances mattered more than authenticity. And if a knight broke the code, if he acted dishonourably, well, consequences varied. A knight might be excommunicated, stripped of titles, publicly shamed. In some cases, disgraced knights were forced to undergo bizarre public penance, like walking barefoot through the streets in a hair shirt, or fighting duels in front of clergy to redeem themselves. But more often, it depended who he offended. If a knight dishonoured a powerful lord or king, his fall could be swift. But if he was popular, wealthy, or politically valuable, he might get away with everything short of murder. And even that was negotiable. Thus, chivalry became a kind of armour in itself, not of steel, but of social protection. If your behaviour looked noble from afar, people often overlooked the stains up close. Despite its flaws, chivalry did inspire some knights to higher ideals. Some truly tried to live with compassion and dignity. But more often, chivalry was aspiration, not reality. It was the halo worn over a bloodied helm, a noble song echoing above a field of broken bones, a candle burning atop a mountain of contradictions. Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle in, and let your mind relax. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and share in the comments where you're from and what time it is for you. We always love hearing from you. It's what makes this journey together feel so real. Now, imagine the night after the last battle. The clang of steel faded, the cheering crowds gone silent. Wounds don't always heal cleanly in the Middle Ages. Many knights return from war not with heroic stories, but with aches, infections, and nightmares. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. A simple cut could become gangrenous. Amputations were brutal and often fatal. And those who survived faced chronic pain that no armour could protect them from. Yet the knight was expected to carry on as a lord, a warrior, or an advisor, while hiding the fragility beneath the bravado. The passage of time was merciless. Youthful vigour gave way to stiffness. Sword swings slowed. Horses grew tired. The bright banners once proudly flown now looked faded and tattered. Many knights found themselves replaced by younger warriors, their names whispered less often at the feasts. This fading of glory wasn't just physical, it cut deep into the soul. To a knight, his worth was tied to honour and prowess, and when those slipped away, so did a piece of himself. Some knights carried scars that no armour could hide, memories of comrades lost, villages burned, and innocent lives shattered They wrestled with guilt and doubt, questioning whether the endless cycle of violence was worth the price. These thoughts were dangerous in a culture that prized stoicism and valor. Many knights kept their pain locked away behind stern faces and stiff collars. Returning home wasn't always a joyous reunion. Family estates might be in disrepair. Political alliances shifted. Loved ones changed or passed on. And the knight, once a figure of strength, often found himself isolated, caught between the world he fought for and the quiet life he no longer understood. This alienation was a slow, painful loneliness that no amount of feast or praise could cure. Some knights retired to monasteries, seeking solace in prayer and quiet reflection. Others became mentors, training the next generation in swordsmanship and strategy. But many simply faded into obscurity, their stories lost to time, their deeds reduced to the stuff of legend and myth. And yet, amid the hardships, there is a subtle hope that after the armor is hung up, the battle's fought, and the noise fades, the knight can finally find peace. Peace in the soft glow of a hearth, in the laughter of grandchildren, in the gentle turning of seasons. Softly, as the chapter closes, the fire's crackle fades into a soothing silence. Wherever you are now, whether the sun is rising or setting, we hope this moment finds you calm, comfortable, and at ease. May your own long road home be gentle and full of quiet light.